All right, great. Good afternoon. Welcome to the China and the United States and the Korean Peninsula panel of the 6th Annual China-US Symposium. The central theme of this year's symposium is trust between the United States and China. And in this panel, in particular, our distinguished speakers will address the roles that China and the United States play in the Korean Peninsula. We will explore the questions of whether or not the two countries can cooperate in addressing the many challenges originating from Korea. In particular, North Korea, it's been in the news quite a bit the last few days, if you've noticed. So just to get the talk started, a few days ago, President Xi Jinping at a Hainan economic conference announced no one should be allowed to dwell a region and even a world into chaos for selfish gains. Yesterday, President Obama announced after a meeting with U.S. General Secretary Ban Ki-moon, now's the time for North Korea to end the kind of belligerent approach that they've been taking and to try to lower temperatures. Now, my name is Quan Lin, and I will serve as the moderator of this panel. We'll start off with 50-minute remarks from each one of our panelists, and after that, we'll have approximately half an hour for questions and answers from the audience. Joining us today are Professor Sung-Yoon Lee. Professor Lee is the Kim Koo Korea Foundation Assistant Professor at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy. We have Dr. Terence Roehrig, who is a professor of National Security Affairs and is the director of the Asia Pacific Studies Group at the U.S. Naval War College. And we have with us Dr. John Park. Dr. Park is a Stanton Junior Faculty Fellow at MIT and an associate with the project on managing the atom at the Harvard Kennedy School. With that, we'll get started with Professor Lee.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you'll pardon my voice. I'm suffering from, as Dean Bosworth put it yesterday at a different conference, that typical New England weather complex, minor cold, let's say. One of the great privileges of being a teacher is that we constantly learn from our students. And one MALD student, who's a current student who's not in the room today, Soo-Yeon Kang, about 2 years ago posed me the following question. Which is the more reliable older brother? China vis-a-vis North Korea, or the United States vis-a-vis South Korea or Taiwan? Let me rephrase that. Which is the less reliable older brother? Which would be more prone to giving up first its dependent junior partner? Would China be more prone to giving up North Korea one day? Or can we imagine that the United States one day might give up South Korea or Taiwan before China does North Korea? What do you think? We can ruminate on that, I think, during this session and maybe even beyond this session. It seems to me that over the past few months, especially in the wake of North Korea's repeated provocative acts, its ICBM test on December 12th last year, the first successful long-range missile test in 5 tries since 1998, and also especially in the wake of North Korea's 3rd nuclear test on February 12th, and the 6-week-long bluster barrage that North Korea has been on, even unusual, really, even by North Korean standards, issuing new threats to blow up a South Korean island, launch a precision nuclear strike against the United States and South Korea, and so forth. This kind of rhetoric is typical of North Korea. The duration and the scale, the intensity and the duration of these threats are somewhat unusual. And it seems that in recent weeks, the opinion seems to have obtained that maybe China is recalculating its strategic interest in the Korean Peninsula, is now more prone to abandoning North Korea. That view has been floated around, most notably by a Chinese academic, the deputy editor of the Central Party School of the Chinese Communist Party, who wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times in late February, February 27th, under the very provocative title, "China Should Abandon North Korea." As you may know, that author since has been relieved of his duties for going against the official Chinese position, but it still broke that taboo, the taboo that China will never give up on North Korea. In my view, such prognostications of China's more willing to give up on North Korea are, at this point, quite premature. Although I would submit to you that vectors of national interest do not run parallel on a parallel course forever, they sometimes converge, they sometimes diverge, and in that context, I can certainly imagine, I think it's certainly conceivable that one day Chinese interests will fundamentally clash with the situation in the Korean Peninsula as created by North Korea, and it's certainly within the realm of the possible that China will one day come to recalculate its strategic interests in Northern Korea and perhaps wave bye-bye to the DPRK as things spiral out of control. But I would say, for now, that day is a distant dream, a distant eventuality or possibility. Under the current situation of North Korea's repeated belligerent remarks and perhaps another missile test, perhaps as early as within the next few hours, April 13th, already in Korea, in East Asia, it's April 13th, I guess. Last year on April 13th, Kim Jong-un assumed the role of the first General Secretary of the Korean Workers' Party. That role he assumed on the 11th of April. And on the 13th of April in 2012, Kim Jong-un assumed the role of the first chairman of the National Defense Commission. And on that day, they fired off an ICBM, which fizzled. So I think they might have a stronger incentive to make up for that embarrassing failure with, for the first time, foreign correspondents, journalists present in Pyongyang by doing it again on this April 13th. They have a knack for doing things on a Sunday so as to capture the global headlines for the rest of the week, thereby putting more pressure on their adversaries, Washington and Seoul, to come up with a response. So Sunday is another possibility. April 15th, as you know, is simply the biggest day in North Korea, the biggest national holiday, the birthday of the founder of the DPRK, Kim Il-sung, the grandfather of the current regime. So my point here is North Korea has a strong incentive to do something, to fire off an intermediate range ballistic missile for the first time, thereby showing the world that it has the capability to hit Guam if it chose to. Let me count the ways that Beijing has showered Pyongyang with love, and then go on to count the ways that Pyongyang has defied and spurned Beijing's overture. We know that during the Korean War, China literally saved the DPRK as it was faltering, as it was about to collapse in late 1950. As the DPRK was on the verge of collapse, China took a gamble, made the difficult decision. It was not an easy decision, and there was much debate within the Chinese Communist Party about the efficacy, the wisdom of intervening in the Korean War and fighting the US-led UN forces straight on. But after much deliberation, China did send hundreds of thousands of troops across the Yalu River into North Korea in late October 1950, and thereby saved the DPRK as it was on the verge of collapse. China paid a huge cost in terms of both lives and treasure. By far, the Chinese suffered the highest number of casualties of all the combatants in that terrible war. And after the end of the war, China granted gratis granted North Korea for free, gratis, all debt that North Korea had incurred during the war, worth about $325 million. So China was very generous as opposed to the Soviet Union. Stalin was viewed as stingy. China was very, very generous in not only having taken a great risk to save North Korea, but financially as well. Even before the start of the war in January, on January 8, 1950, Mao agreed to send the 3rd Division of the ethnically Korean PLA troops to North Korea in order to reinforce North Korean troops. So Mao showed consistently that he was more interested in bolstering the DPRK than Stalin during those days. Of course, China entered the war out of self-interest, not altruism. The Chinese leader, Mao Zedong, had a strong incentive to prove his credentials as the leader of the Asian Communist movement. If he had just sat by as the DPRK was collapsing, that would have had negative implications on his international and regional status. He was viewed as the leader of the Asian Communist movement. And to see the formation of a US-led united Korea right in China's Northeast Asian backyard would have had negative implications on Mao's designs to liberate Taiwan. And most importantly, China had a plan B, a fallback plan in the Soviet Union. If things really turned for the worse, then perhaps the Soviet Union could intervene as well. So Mao had, I would say, compelling reasons to intervene in the war in 1950. Since the end of the Cold War, we know that China has consistently provided North Korea with essentials, food, fuel, and other things, even increasing aid to North Korea after the adoption of various UN Security Council resolutions that purportedly seek to punish North Korea. So China has been very generous to North Korea and has put up with an intransigent North Korea. Now let me count the ways Pyongyang has spurned and defied Beijing. Despite hailing from the so-called Manchuria faction of guerrilla fighters, Kim Il-sung, the founder of the DPRK, despite having lived in China for many years since his early boyhood, upon return to Korea, and soon after the establishment of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, what does he do? Kim Il-sung seeks to eliminate all vestiges of Chinese culture in North Korea. And one of the first things he did, which was in June 1949 in terms of his educational policy, was to ban the use of Chinese characters. So as of the summer of 1949, all newspapers, government documents, books, periodicals, and so forth, all written text in North Korea henceforth were to be published in the Korean alphabet, not using Chinese characters at all. Also in 1950, in the lead-up to the Korean War, Kim would dismiss Mao's fears, concerns about the possibility of a U.S. intervention by telling Mao fake stories, how Stalin had reassured him that the U.S. would not intervene because, look, hey, the U.S. had done nothing about the Chinese communist victory in the Chinese Civil War. Why would they intervene in a smaller prize, a smaller arena called the Korean Peninsula? So Kim Il-sung would make up such stories to reassure Mao. And then he would tell the Soviet ambassador in Pyongyang also equally fake stories, telling him that Mao had told him if the U.S. intervenes, then Mao believed it was the fundamental duty of the Chinese to intervene, to fight the U.S., not the Soviets. So Kim Il-sung was quite duplicitous or crafty, depending on your view. Let me give you a couple more examples. A few years after the end of the war, in 1956, we have, in September 1956, an unprecedented, the only really intervention of its kind, a joint Soviet-Chinese punitive intervention, a punitive mission to Pyongyang. Because Kim Il-sung was purging imprisoning and eliminating and executing many pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese factional leaders in government, the Soviet Union and the PRC sent two very high-profile respective Chinese and Russian envoys to tell Kim Il-sung, hey, stop this, or else. Or else they strongly intimated, we will seek to replace you with a different leader. Well, those two envoys were quite famous. The Russian was Anastas Mikoyan, who was one of the most high-profile international high-ranking figures in the Politburo. The Chinese envoy was Peng Dehuai, Kim Il-sung's senior commander, the Chinese commander during the war, and by this time, the Minister of National Defense. Well, Kim Il-sung said, okay, I'll tone it down. After a few months, he did it again, much more so, and did eliminate all pro-Soviet and pro-Chinese political rivals by force by 1960. Later on, we know he also leveled North Korean cemeteries where tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers, fallen Chinese soldiers, had been buried. So my point here is North Korea has really gotten away with a lot of things. I feel obliged to give you one more really egregious example. In 1982, Kim Il-sung traveled with Deng Xiaoping to Deng's homeland, or hometown, I should say, Sichuan province, and in order to reassure the Chinese leader that Kim Jong-il, his heir apparent, would be pro-China and would be open to seeking reform, doing things more along the Chinese ways, Chinese lines, Kim Il-sung told Deng, my son, henceforth, will visit China each year to learn about Chinese economic reform. We know Kim Jong-il did nothing of the kind. And then the next year, in June 1983, Kim Il-sung brought Kim Jong-il to meet the Chinese leader and the leadership to Beijing. That is the only instance of Kim Jong-il ever having met Deng Xiaoping. Why? Because a few months later, when Deng Xiaoping thought maybe North Korea was finally turning around, coming around, willing to change, Deng Xiaoping told the U.S. Defense Secretary, Caspar Weinberger, that North Korea is amenable to talks with the U.S. and indeed wants to talk to America. This was in September 1983. And then on October 8th, 1983, Deng Xiaoping, or China I should say, conveyed to Washington the following message, that North Korea seeks direct diplomatic talks with Washington. He was very happy to do so. The very next day, what happens in Rangoon, Burma? You have the terrorist bombing, a bomb planted by North Korean agents that was really for the visiting South Korean president. He was running late, his life was spared, but 17 of South Korea's highest ranking officials were lost in that terrorist campaign. And this was a huge loss of face for Deng Xiaoping. And thereafter, Deng was resolved that he would never see Kim Jong-il, have anything to do with Kim Jong-il ever again. Kim Jong-il would not visit to China again until 2000. And that would be his maiden voyage as the leader of North Korea, as the General Secretary of the Korean Workers' Party in May 2000. I want to very quickly, I know my time is running out or has run out already, but let me just take literally 1 minute and go over some of Kim Jong-il's visits to China since 2000. So the first was in late May 2000, and this was 2 weeks before the first ever Inter-Korean Summit in mid-June 2000. Obviously, the two parties had something to talk about in preparing for the first ever Inter-Korean Summit meeting. The second trip came in January 2001, and there was much speculation because Kim Jong-il visited Shanghai that perhaps he is now finally willing to reform. This was on the eve of the inauguration of the Bush administration, which was viewed to be quite different from the Clinton administration in its Korea policy. So China and North Korea had much to discuss during this time. The third visit was in April 2004. That visit is noteworthy for perhaps an attempted assassination attempt on Kim Jong-il. Ryongchon Station in North Korea, there was a huge explosion a few hours after Kim Jong-il's train had passed through in April 2004. The next trip came in January 2006. This is significant, ladies and gentlemen, because this is a few months after the implementation of the Banco Delta Asia sanctions, so-called. The U.S. Treasury Department sanctions cracking down on North Korea's illicit activities, and purportedly Kim Jong-il told Hu Jintao in January in 2006, at this rate, we're going to collapse. Please help us. And then we have the first visit by Kim Jong-il in the post-stroke era, when he looks visibly frail. Kim Jong-il suffered a stroke in August 2008, as we know, and that's in May 2010, the visit. And then, remarkably, just 5 months later, he would visit China again in late August 2010. And that day, Jimmy Carter visited Pyongyang to win the release of a Boston man. And literally on that day, Kim Jong-il took the midnight train for China. And the very last trip comes in May 2011. And there are speculations that maybe he brought Kim Jong-un with him and introduced him to the various leading members, the standing committee members of the Politburo. My point here is the bilateral relationship has been one-sided. China has been the giving party, North Korea has been the receiving party, and that has been an agreeable arrangement. Not always happy, of course. The Chinese have many reasons to be displeased, but an agreeable arrangement that China has willingly entered into and that China will go on maintaining for the foreseeable future. Thank you.